It's my distinct pleasure to introduce the speaker of this session. Vladimir Safatle is a full professor in the Department of Philosophy at the State University of São Paulo in Brazil. He obtained his PhD from the Université de Paris 8 in 2002. Professor Safatle's main research areas include the philosophy of psychoanalysis, the philosophy of music, critical theory, and the Hegelian dialectical tradition. Professor Safatle has been a highly prolific author in all these fields, with a vast number of books, articles, and book chapters. Given the theme of our conference, I would like to highlight just a few of his works. Le circuit des affaires, corps politique, détresse et l'enfant de l'individu, a book original published in Portuguese in 2015 and later translated into Spanish, 2019, in Italian, 2021, and French, 2022. And the Grand Hotel Abyss, Desire, Recognition, and the Restoration of the Subject, original published in Portuguese in 2012, then translated into English in 2016. In addition to his academic work, Professor Safatle contributes regularly to newspapers and magazines in Brazil and is widely recognized as an important public intellectual, active in both political and cultural debates. The talk he will deliver today is entitled The Historical Limits of Autonomy and the Restoration of Autochtony, for a Notion of Freedom as Heteronomy Without Servitude. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause to welcome our speaker. Professor Safatle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I prefer to standing because it's easier for me. Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for this invitation. For me, it's a real pleasure to be here and to take part of all these discussions. And I would like to start by saying that belonging to oneself is something we learn to do in two ways. We can say that we belong to ourselves when we appear as the legislators of ourselves, when we govern ourselves, and in this case, the law we give ourselves is the most finished figure of the exercise of our self-belonging. It is the expression of our identity, of our capacity to be under our own jurisdiction. It does appear as the main instrument of our self-determination, since it allows us to evaluate ourselves from a principle that is not an external determination, but the exercise of our free will. We call this regime normally of self-belonging autonomy, because there is a law that defines what's proper to us, and this law would be internal to us, establishing a relationship of immanent identity. But it's possible to belong to oneself in another way, namely by having been generated by the earth on which one stands. And in this case, it is the land that defines belonging. There is a land that defines what is ours, like a genus that can be both birth, lineage, and family. And this land is the space in which we can circulate without frontiers or barriers. It is a space that defines relationship of security not only against generalized dispossession, but also against chaos. And we call this regime of self-belonging autochtony because there is a soil, a ton, that defines what is ours. And it's no coincidence that these two regimes of belonging have historically determined the axis of what we understand as freedom and emancipation, with their own social struggles. Being free seems to us quite naturally something that requires, in certain circumstances, mobilizing the capacity to give ourselves or our own law, to not be subjected to any legislation that is not the expression of our own will. But we will also find emancipatory social struggles trying to preserve or create ties to a land in which we can move freely and from which we came. This coming from has declined in various mythological constructions as both the act of being generated by the earth and the act of being manufactured through the earth, through the clay, to the mud, to the marsh, to the dust. In short, two devices of self-belonging, namely the law and the land. One marks a specific exercise of legislation, and the other a specific regime of circulation. But however, it is possible that our contemporary historical horizon shows certain limits to these two ways of defining the social realization of freedom, which force us to consciously rework epistemically certain values that might see within our social practice to be unproblematic. And what I would like to do in this conference is to insist on these limits and the need to both recognize the exhaustion of a certain hegemonic model of autonomy and recover the centrality of understanding freedom from a renewed notion of autochtony. And I would begin by insisting that such an exercise is necessary because we are facing something we could call, let's say, an epistemic crisis. And by epistemic crisis, we mean a crisis in the, sorry for this Kantian idea, conditions of possibility of all possible experience. Huh? A crisis in our horizon of determining meaning. Our social experience with its forms of categorization, distinction, organization of space and time is not a transcendental condition, but a social institution. It depends on material conditions of reproduction embodied in repeated economic and political process. And these forms, in turn, offer what we could call a social grammar that defines our way of determining not only the meaning of values with a strong normative potential, but also how to apply them, the clarity of their semantics, and above all, the form of the subjects who can enunciate them. And when the social grammar goes into crisis, our ability to orient ourselves in experience on the basis of values will also be in crisis. And I would like to insist that we are experiencing something similar today, and this is linked, among other things, to the exhaustion of the hegemonic process of progress, growth, material reproduction, and development that have marked our capitalist modernity. These processes could not impose themselves without the continuous mobilization of values aimed at justify their course and their violence. The social production of wealth is not something that can be done without a recourse to horizons of legitimization, linked to the desire to have the material conditions to be ourselves, to belong to ourselves, thus establishing an important relationship between social wealth and freedom. And for this reason, capitalist extractivism, its dynamics of accumulation and colonialism, its subjection of things to the abstraction of the production of value, were paradoxically presented as the material condition for realizing our expectations of emancipation, either by making us master of nature, as Descartes, Locke, and so on, which would allow us to emancipate ourselves from the supposed material scarcity and unpredictability of natural force, or by imposing the conditions for the emergence of societies of autonomous individuals, owners and maximizers of their own interests across the globe. as if freedom were only possible where societies were organized as associations of individuals. In other words, it was always in the name of individual freedom that what we understand as economic development took place, with this necessary process of social rationalization. And the collapse of this process cannot, therefore, leave untouched the systems of valuation, of values and judgments that they themselves mobilized. And therefore, when we talk about the current existence of related crises, like ecological crisis, political, economic, social, and demographic, crises that feed back on each other and stabilize as crises, we must take into account that the association of these crises with the acceleration of the ecological decomposition of our living conditions highlight in an increasingly urgent way horizons of profound irrationality of our process of social modernization. The ecological crisis and its brutal acceleration is a new element in the crisis dynamics that capitalism has experienced. It shows, like no other, how the development of productive forces become the development of destructive forces, to speak like Marx. How the realization of our hegemonic forms of life produce an unviable material horizon. And it is the awareness of such irrationality that accelerates the explicitness of what we can call the epistemic crisis, because we have the material confirmation of an impasse in our modes of modernization and social rationalization. And in this scenario, I would like to insist that even what we have hegemonically understood as freedom and emancipation becomes problematic. Okay, remembering that is a way of underlining that an important task of contemporary critical thinking is to reorient the structures and practices of emancipation, to be sensitive to their new configurations and demands. And in other words, it is not a question of settling for discourse that understand this crisis as the result of partial rationalizations, as we hadn't guided our modernization process by demands for freedom for all, emancipation for all, but only for certain classes and subjects. As if it were only a case of better universalizing what has guided our liberal societies and which would provide solid base for consensus. On the contrary, it would be a case of insisting that the problem is not one of restricted universalization. Rather, the crises we are currently facing are in a way necessary realizations of the values we have mobilized. These values could not produce anything else. And because, in a way, it's not just the dominant economic model that is showing itself to be extractivist, segregating, and violent. Our hegemonic conception of emancipation was extractivist, segregating, and violent. And it demanded an ontological rupture between freedom and nature that ended up producing the necessary disengagement responsible for the actual extractivist degradation of the natural horizon. It demanded a model of self-belonging that created defensive concepts of identity and unity with their violent reactions to any otherness that might affect us by taking us out of the jurisdiction of ourselves. And assuming this perspective obliges us to think on alternative concepts of emancipation that have failed, at least so far, to impose themselves as paths capable of hegemonically mobilizing our social imagination. Okay, there are multiple strategies that can be mobilized when faced with a similar task. They range from the recovery of epistemic metrics silenced and buried by capitalist expansionist colonialism, to the complexification of what we mean by modernity. Complexification that aims to highlight how even within the geographical space where capitalist modernity has emerged, it is necessary to be sensitive to the conflict metrics that have also been silenced, or, if we wish, that have remained as unrealized potentialities. And I would insist that such an alternative becomes particularly important at a time when modernity as such is disqualified as an aggressive, expansionist, and Eurocentric operation, without taking into account how this modernity that we know, with its problematic and colonial consequence, is the result of a particular and specific liberal capitalist inflection. An inflection that, in order to impose itself, had to silence alternative possibilities and impose an internal colonialism, even on European soil. Not taking this conflict into account produced the illusion that we are describing a unitary and a monolithic epistemic process, even though its social basis is contradictory, marked by social struggles and dispossessions in all the territories where this process took place. For it's impossible for an antagonistic society to magically produce a non-antagonistic episteme. And this shows that there is a lot of idealism in what we conventionally call the colonial criticism. The idealism to believing that epistemic matrix can develop without taking into account the material and social contradictions of their time. And with this problem in mind, we could, for example, try to recover alternative conceptions of autonomy that are not linked to the traditional roots of what we understand by self-legislation and self-government, with its naturalized legal horizon, its inner tribunals, and its coercive dynamics. Okay, well, today we accept that one of the fundamental characteristics of moral autonomous subjects is a certain form of immanent identity. To be the legislator of myself, to be the enunciator of the law that expresses my freedom, this law must be mine. If it were, for example, the law of another that I have internalized, a law imposed to me through coercion, it would be an expression of my servitude, not my freedom. When the law is exercised, its exercise implies the constitution of a space in which I cannot lose myself. A space in which I belong to no one but myself. And this is why Kant, for example, insisted that the causality presented in autonomous action is a causality that fulfills expectations of spontaneity, a causality through freedom. And this freedom is another way of saying that there is a kind of sameness involved in the exercise of autonomy. Freedom as autonomy is not just about asserting oneself beyond the causality of nature and the mechanistic dispositions that would seemingly subjugate everything that is an object. Freedom as autonomy is being in possession of oneself, in possession of my actions, of my reasons for acting. We usually associate autonomy with a fundamental capacity for self-reflection. We then say that an autonomous subject is someone capable of taking themselves, take him or herself as an object of inspection. But let's remember that through the act of taking oneself as the object of self-reflection, I exercise self-possession. Because through self-reflection, I objectify what in me is still affected by an external causality. I objectify in the sense of disposing before me, of taking possession of something by placing it before me. And in the same movement, I take distance from what caused me outside my own domain. And I affirm the primacy of decisions enunciated in a space of immanent identity with myself. And in this space, without distance, I would experience what I means, beyond its purely psychological reality. I becomes a form of participation in a transcendental horizon of judgment and deliberation, independent of the experience that empirical selves may have. Well, I recall this elaboration that everyone here is familiar with in order to raise two questions. Firstly, we can't talk about possession and belonging without taking into account the social historical configuration of the act of taking possession. I think that Veronica had developed this yesterday too. No? If we accept that freedom cannot just be understood as an exercise of individual expression, but that it is in fact a mode of social relationship, then it would be important to ask ourselves how certain philosophical concepts linked to the normative structuring of the notion of freedom can currently be signified. And with this in mind, I would say that in the current historical conditions, it is not possible to insist on a form of belonging that is not expressed under the regime of property, which our capitalist societies, within our capitalist societies, all forms of belonging and possession have been colonized by a general form expressing in property relations. It would not be possible to ignore the fact that there is something like a metaphysical force of capitalism that is a way of shaping the general possibilities of existence and relationships through the generalization of an ontology of property that organize even our forms of emancipation. Even the vocabulary of our struggles is conjugated within an ontology of properties, in which is always a question of making explicit what would be mine and what would, if this is the case, an emancipation understood as self-belonging will be a form of reification because it will depend on the social use of the notion of property. On the other hand, there is an affective issue that I'd like to highlight. Kant used it to recall Horace's affirmation, sapere aude, to speak of a courage that would be the central affect of the autonomy and self-determination of emancipated subjects. But we can ask ourselves if our notion of moral autonomy, which has such a paradigmatic expression in Kantian philosophy, isn't based on another affect, namely fear. For perhaps we should remember that an emancipation dependent of the grammar of self-mastery, self-imposed legislation, and the atavistic fear of being caused by what causes us from outside cannot be emancipation at all. For as Spinoza highly understood, if the affective base of freedom is always the deposition of fear, we can say that we need to think above all the deposition of one of the fears that make up the modern definition of autonomy, namely the fear of not being one's own cause, of no longer being in one's own jurisdiction, fear of submitting to an external causality that would decenter our consciousness, fear of being confused with what in us does not submit to the figure of the unitary and conscious will, fear of a body that is not confused with egoity. In other words, these are all possible variations of the confusion so characteristic of a certain modern metaphysic dogma, a confusion between heteronomy and servitude, between not being in the jurisdiction of oneself and being in a condition of slavery. This affective basis and its consequence becomes clear if we remember the genealogy of autonomy, and in it we find a political theology whose roots take us back to St. Augustine, with his themes of human exceptionalism, of the split in human nature between a body marked by libido and autonomous will capable of guaranteed free will. I would like to insist on the thesis that our hegemonic concept of moral autonomy is dependent on a political theology horizon, which, far from being denied, offered the conditions for the naturalization of the splits necessary to affirm our capacity to self-legislation. And I would like to remind you that the human exceptionalism presupposed in our notion of autonomy is, in a way, here to the demand that the unsubmission of the body and nature be contained, that the libido not rule, and that the resemblance to the rationality of the divine will be felt. This political theology, in turn, will be one of the foundations for the construction of a nature as a space ready to be appropriated by value-producing labor and brutal extractivism, of development as a subjection and a domination of nature. As if to point out that the hegemonic process of modernization that the West has experienced, linked to the rise of capitalism and its liberal modern model of subjects, could only produce an autonomy that perpetuates internal divisions, fears, and external subjections. And there can be no emancipation where division, fear, and subjection prevail. For this reason, I don't think it's possible to think about autonomy without explaining the links between morality, economics, and theology that it presupposes. But let's start by asking, is everything that causes my actions outside my will, everything that breaks the jurisdiction of the law I once seemed to give to myself, really an attack against my freedom? Wouldn't there a concept of freedom among us for which I'm free when I'm able to open myself up to what I don't completely control, to what doesn't submit to the law I took to my own, and which appears to me as involuntary, as contingent, and unconscious? This other conception would say that freedom is knowing that there is always a profound otherness that affects and transforms me, and that this is why my actions are never completely mine. Thinking like this would make us better able to listen to what passes through us without even acquire the form of ourselves. Well, if I had more time, but not the case, no? I could recall how, against this political theology of autonomy, the modern aesthetics experience had provided us with alternative models of autonomy, as if certain social practices, such as the aesthetic experience, could open up possibilities that run counter to hegemonic epistemic matrix, preserving the possibility of accomplishing what societies don't yet know how to accomplish. For there is no episteme without a counter-episteme, without praxis and discourse that preserve within specific societies what those societies exclude as a possibility. And I would then try to show the mistake in considering aesthetic autonomy as an expression of self-referential capacity of works of art, as we know through Clemens Greenberg Kantism. I would insist that this is a historical mistake that ignores how the problem of aesthetic autonomy is born with another problem in mind, namely how the aesthetic form can integrate elements that deny the naturalized structures of sensibility. And this would oblige us to discuss the emergence of aesthetic autonomy in the musical debate of the 18th century. The emergence of an aesthetic form able to build itself from dissonance, or in other words, from what shakes the sensibility. However, it would be impossible to fit this development into the time I have left, and this is why it's just an indication. But I prefer not to elaborate on this point, because in the horizon of social tensions that marks our time with its crisis, it wouldn't be possible to avoid asking about the other aspect of our problem concerning the forms of belonging to oneself, namely autochtony. That is the point I'd like to get to. And because our struggles for emancipation could not be indifferent to the fact that land has become one of the central political devices of our time. Whether in the contemporary resurgence of fascism, in the current configuration of anti-colonial social struggles, or in the struggles of autonomies to occupy zones, even temporarily, in order to allow other forms of life to flourish there, the mobilization of land, territory, and space plays a fundamental role. And in other words, the relationship to the space is a major axis of dispute within political horizons of transformation and emancipation. This reminds us that a discussion on emancipation centered exclusively on the motives of autonomy, as it has been hegemonically understood within our contemporary debates until now, I think it's insufficient. In other words, as much as the development of capitalism has sought to impose on us the belief that our era has erased ties to the territory in order to lead societies to mimic the free flow of capital, thus creating the illusion that any ties to the territory could only be a kind of social regression, we must to be sensitive to the fact that various struggles for emancipation use precisely the recourse of the territory as a strategy. And for this is a way of trying to disconnect space from its flows of monetary indifference, from its commodification, and to build singularities. I like to insist on this point because the modern debate of freedom has largely led us to believe that it should eliminate the link to the land. As if philosophy were repeating the social experience of enclosures that inaugurate English capitalism through the destruction of common land and the transformation of the peasant mass into a waged labor force. Primitive accumulation requires the transformation of land into a space of the valorization of capital. It requires its degradation as a space for free circulation. And it becomes a hostile space if it's not dominated by value-producing labor. Without the marks of labor and its structures of recognition, the land becomes a trap. On the social horizon, a certain philosophy seems to be summoned to compensate for the loss of territory with promise of individual moral autonomy, as if it were a case of becoming unaccustomed to looking at the rootedness of our freedom in forms of circulation and use of things. In fact, territoriality can often be confused with the affirmation of organic ties to communities, habits, and traditions. In this case, it might initially seem that autochtony is the affirmation of the self through belonging to a territory. It might be seen that autochtony should be understood as the fundamental expression of temporalized recourse to origin, as a guarantee for the social production of meaning. However, we can ask ourselves how much this operation is more the result of our projections and regressions than a trace of the anthropological reality that surrounds us. We can say that this use of territory is a social experience proper to modernity and not exactly an ontological condition. A more precise anthropological analysis would remind us how belonging to the land has often been thought of as a space of relationships to an otherness that implies a relationship to multiplicity of living beings, to other life cycles than my own. I could give an example through an anthropological research of Amerindian people carried out by a Brazilian anthropologist, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. One of the interests of this research is to show how belonging to the land is thought of as a form of generic implication between human and nature that provides the condition for a recognition of otherness that is much broader than the struggle of recognition between consciousness, with its basic human exceptionalism. Instead of recognition between consciousness, we have recognition between living beings who unfold different forms of being conscious. This is a richer and more complex level of otherness than the otherness of autonomous subjects. Hence a statement like, and I quote Viveros, all animals and other components of the cosmos are intensively persons, virtually persons, because any of them can reveal itself, transform itself into a person. This is talking about Amerindian cosmovisions. This is not merely a logical possibility, but an ontological potentiality. We could see in this only the expression of an animism linked to the projective structures of pre-logical thinking. Of course, we always have done that. But perhaps this only indicates our difficulty in thinking about dynamics of reversibility and recognition beyond the naturalization of the metaphysical distinction between people and things, person and things. In this cosmopolitics, every existing being, whether human or animal, participates in the same humanity because society is not just a mode of relationship between humans. There is no society without relationship between humans and non-humans, between humans and non-humans living beings. If animals have souls like us, what makes us different are our bodies, which establish unique perspectives based on a specific system of affections. Thus, a multiplicity of bodies presupposes a multiplicity of perspectives under the univocity of the same humanity. Contrary to our multiculturalism, a peculiar multinaturalism appears in which various concepts of nature cut across the plane of the same field of culture. This univocity of culture allows us for a generalized operation of the centering. If the same humanity is present in humans and animals, then nothing is unequivocally human. In this sense, to say that animals have souls like us means recognizing that our agency is the result of being affected by what does not necessarily bear our image. We are affected by a land in which there is a multiplicity of relationships that cannot be reduced to the figure of another consciousness. Hence, an important point, and I also quote Viveros, quite contrary to our fantasies about the narcissist paradise of exotic peoples, the radical presupposition of the human does not make the indigenous world more familiar or more comforting. Everything is human, the human is everything else. And I would therefore end by insisting on the political force of such a redimensioning of our reflection on freedom. Hegel once tried to complexify the demands of autonomy by reminding us of the binding character of social practice and historical process. In other words, allowing the beginning of a materialistic turn that show us how every transcendental determination is a social institution, as once Robert Brandon said. Perhaps it's time for us to complexify this strategy and remember that society is bigger than the intersubjective structure of consciousness. It is also made up of non-humans, of things, of territories, of life cycles that affect us, that cause our action from the outside, without this heteronomy necessarily meaning servitude. A society is a system of metabolisms larger than we are willing to admit. It is the actualization of a natural history in the sense of process of collective experience embodied in the ritualized intercourse we have with beings in natural space. For this reason, completing the materialistic turn on freedom requires giving autochtony the necessary centrality in our struggle for reconstruct what we can be and what we don't want to be anymore. Thank you so much.
So the floor is open.
Thank you for the great talk. I have a question on the relation of autochtony, the way you presented it, with regards to territory and being the condition of possibility for certain forms of freedom on the one hand, and let's say national state, the form of state, concrete, specific historical forms of state and society, because of course some people could could think that autochtony is somehow defending in an implicit manner a claim to a national state, and I suspect that this is not that it's the opposite actually, that you want to think of a state in a different way. So that I would just be interested to hear what you think about this relation of political forms and autochtony.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you so much for the question. It's a very important one. Actually, I think that it's interesting to, let's say, problematize the relationship between emancipation and autochtony exactly for avoiding the idea that every discussion of autochtony should result in a discussion about the nation state. First, because, well, I can talk about my country, for example, because maybe the ex-colonial countries, they have something interesting on this point. The creation of a nation state is a kind of destruction of possibility, multiple possibilities of history and social forms in the same territory. Then the result is that we have a nation state that is just the erasement of, let's say, other multiple forms to create freedom and justice. When, for example, people in Bolivia, they decide to defend the possibility to a post-national state, this idea of a plurinational state. I think that there is a very interesting legal notion there. That is, a territory can be a multiplicity of space at the same time. And if you want to create emancipated society, we cannot erase this anymore. It's not possible to erase this anymore. Then we can say that there is a way to complexify the social relations that are embedded in space and territory that go beyond the notion of nation state. And maybe this is one of the reasons that we have this regressive notion of autochtony, exactly to avoid the possibility to emergence of this other type of relationship.
Thanks for the talk. I'm sorry if the question is a bit broad, but I mean, you basically departed from the notion that there's a modern notion of freedom that is problematic because it assumes that freedom is always acting according to one's own will to be the cause of your action. And given that this is a conference from the Center for Post-Kantian Philosophy, I guess I was just perplexed that Hegel played no role at all in your talk, because I think basically 99% of Hegelians would see Hegel as resolving that problem. So I guess I was just wondering, what do you think of Hegel, and why do you think he doesn't solve the problem for you?
No, it's not. It's a funny way to put the question, but okay. Let's say, first of all, I think that there is a problem with the notion of belonging. And what I try to do is actually to insist that historically we have in the West, these two possibilities to think about freedom, autonomy and autochtony, since the Greeks. Then actually there is the idea of belonging inside autochtony obliges us to the idea of belonging inside autonomy obliges us to reconstruct the notion of autonomy. It's possible to reconstruct it. This is the reason that I just pointed, well, if we try to think about ecstatic experience and autonomy in aesthetic field, maybe we have a possible path. No? But we can do the same with autochtony. No? But your question is not exactly that. Your question is why Hegel is not here. No? And my answer will be, it's because I think that we can use the notion of recognition, Hegelian notions of recognition, as a way to reframe the problem of autonomy, but we need to go a little bit beyond this, the limits of recognition in the Hegelian social philosophy, because the limits of recognition is based on the I ask for recognition to another consciousness. And I would just insist that it's possible that we need recognition not as a process between two consciousness, but also between what is a consciousness and what has not a form of a consciousness. It's true that there is this path in Hegel when he insists in this reflective process between subject and object. And the need that the object will be also, in a certain way, apprehended as a subject. And I think that I see my perspective as a Hegelian one, in a way that is just a question of go a little bit further and insisted that what is exactly a society then? Because if we accept that a society is not just, let's say, an association between free individuals, but it's also a system of metabolism between humans and non-humans, between humans and things, between humans and space, between humans and environment, then I think that we have broader levels of recognition that we need to deal with. And it's, in a way, it's just a way to be faithful to Hegelianism in a heterodoxal perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much, really, for the talk. I'm very sympathetic with the idea that this background that you sketched forces us to redefine some notions like society and so on. And I tried a little bit to do with Viveros de Castro, but I have a philosophical problem with Viveros de Castro, and I wanted to ask you if you can help me. And Viveros de Castro says that we have no more to talk about different cultures because this idea of multiculturalism presupposes, so to say, a universal ontology with different interpretations of this ontology. We have to think to a multinaturalism that is a multi-ontologism, so to say. So every I don't know if I can say culture, but every autochthony people or so have a specific ontology. But my problem is really, I don't know, it is perhaps trivial. How can I recognize another ontology if there is not a sort of background, a sort of universality, in a certain sense, who give me the possibility to recognize the other. The risk I see in Viveros de Castro perspective, or the multi-perspectivism, is to give rise to a sort of new version of the discourse of the otherness.
I see.
I don't know if it is clear, my
No,
problem,
it's
and what
clear.
you think about it.
No, it's a very interesting point. I think that I see the problem, and it's funny, my position to defend him, because actually we fight for decades. We found, but okay, but I think that there is something very interesting on this point, is because, well, his idea is it's possible to understand a society as, let's say, a common ground of many different natures, no? A common culture from many different natures. And because every nature is organized by the body perspective of each species, no? Then of course this is the one way. It's not just an amenistic perspective, no? A projective perspective, but it's the way that we respond for the affection created by, let's say, the other types of body in our society, inside our society. Then the interesting thing is our society knew many types of bodies, many types of bodies in connection. Then this will create a kind of, let's say, of a perspective of knowledge that is not just abstracted from these connections. Then my perspective of knowledge is a response to that. Okay, this I think is a very interesting point. But you said that, well, how we know that we are just entering a kind of, let's say, an eloge of a otherness, a radical otherness. I think that there is a very interesting point, because he was criticized sometimes for discovering Deleuzian's indigenous peoples in Amazon, no? Saying, well, but your indigenous people, they're unbelievable. They think as anti-Oedipus. And it's a funny thing, because I think that the criticism was made to say, well, this is just a philosophical projection. No? But maybe there is something more interesting on this point. Maybe there is the idea that well, if it's truth that any hegemonic structure of epistemic create also its resistance structures, then of course that what will happen? Well, we have two movements of hegemonizing an epistemic. Episteme. One, it's this colonial movement, where we will just erase some possible epistemes, different cosmovisions, and the other one, we will just silence what happened in our own territory. And of course, this will not be strange to see the connections between these alternative perspectives in Western metaphysics, no? And what was erased in another territories. No? And I think that this connection is not just intellectual, let's say, production. No, it's the conscious result and the conscious sustained idea that this experience of freedom and emancipation, that of course that was the base for this reaction of systems of thought, it's present in every social form. No? Freedom is not just a gift that we create here and we go out there with this gift. It's something that in a certain way connected in a kind of other type of universality, let's say a universality of resonance, no? between different social experience.
I don't know if you know this paper of David Graeber, the anarchist sociologist, who say to Viveiros that his philosophical perspective is a new form of colonialism, in the sense that to say that the other has a totally different ontology from mine is a way in order to put these people or this culture into a diversity who is a sort of new form of polite colonialism in this sense.
Sure. No, I remember this paper, but I think that it's a very interesting paper. There is just one problem: it's wrong. This is the only problem. And this is wrong because actually what is the question here is to say no, what we are saying is that there is no radical otherness in this case. No, it's almost a repetition of something that we know. That means it's something that interferes. There is a kind of we recognize themselves in the or something of them ourselves in these different ontology structures. What is a very interesting point? It means we live in different ontologies. It's in a certain they are there in a certain way because these ontologies are the product or a kind of suffering produced by an hegemonic way of thinking, then this suffering is what connects us globally in a certain way.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a very similar question also to otherness, which you responded mostly. I'm just going to say it again in case there's anything else to clarify. My question was, you define otherness as relation to other lives, life forms, bodies. What does it all incorporate? Or is it like, did I get it right?
I would say that we know varied levels of otherness. There is another consciousness as a type of level of otherness. To be recognized as an object is another type of level of otherness. But normally, when I say something like to be recognized as object, it means that I'm reified myself. Then it means a kind of fetishistic perspective. I'm just an object. But there is something interesting on all these anthropological debates, because it's funny to be here in this position, because I think it's the first time that is happening with me, because normally in Brazil I do the whole role of the Hegelian, Now I'm seeing that I'm totally in opposite place, but okay. But actually it's just it's a very interesting point to say, well, maybe we know this idea of this type of fetishism that implies that I take myself as an object, as a thing. But there is also another type of fetishism. Balibar developed that saying there is a fetishism of the person. This idea that just a person can act. There is just agency in a person. But objects cannot have agency. This is not evident. We can say no, of course, no. If there is something that is interesting in psychoanalysis, is exactly this perspective. To say, no, actually, the objects has a agency. And these objects are not just, let's say, the reified experience of the other desire that is in me, in myself, but it's also an object in everything that was socially put as an object. As something that has not the power to affect my decisions, that does not affect my decisions and my deliberations. But if this is the case, there is another type of otherness in this level, and there is also, it's possible to insist that we should another type of recognition. There is another level of recognition that we should develop for better understand what can be, let's say, an emancipated agency.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'm very sympathetic with many things of your talk, but I had a similar reaction to the autochtony as Alexei has, thinking of not so much of the nation state, but more of a EU's reaction to migration, for example, and saying, okay, this is ours and you stay out. And now you, on your answer to him, you said, okay, there are two different notions of belonging or autochtony, but I think the term autochtony, precisely because of this it's somehow so much, I don't know, evokes or is very ambivalent in that respect. And but maybe it's wrong. But I was thinking, what would you think as a way to distinguish the two senses of belonging, to use the term of hospitality? So to not think of the land, I belong to the land in the sense of I come here, that's where I come from, or so. But yeah, in these different terms, which I think is more kind of in the migration debate, and this question of having different people on the land is often used.
No, I really appreciate the question, because I think that this just shows us how this is a so crucial idea on our social struggles. What is a land? What exactly a land means? And of course, there is this regressive use of land and territory and earth that we know, and we know the consequences. And also, the interesting thing is also in many other societies, let's say, the fight for a land means absolutely another thing. Yeah. For example, we are talking about phenon, and there is this phenon idea that, well, and land is the space that I can circulate. I can just circulate. No? I can circulate without barriers, without frontiers. Exactly the opposite that we normally think when we talk about autochtony. And it's a very interesting point because maybe one important question on struggles, social struggles for emancipation is to destroy a certain notion of land. Is to reconstruct dramatically a certain notion of land. And I remember one example that maybe is very, very funny about a subject that's not funny at all. Because I was writing a paper on Bela Bartok. And all the Bela Bartok's work with all this melodies, these songs that has actually no land. Because, for example, he was his diaries. He was just writing, saying, you know, he was Hungarian. I was in Romania, and when I was in Romania, the Romanians said, "But what are you doing here?" I said, "No, but I'm just trying to understand the circulation of a certain song." I said, "No, but this is our song." He said, and then he was to Slovakia, and he discovered that actually the Romanian song was the Slovakian one. But the funny thing is that, well, the Slovaks, they just forgot that because they took the song from the Romanians and they created a third thing. And they said, you see, there is not a question of nation or nationalism on that. It's a question to how to destroy a certain political notion of geography to show how a space of what means a space of circulation. Even historically in cultural circulation.
Thank you so much, Vladimir, for this beautiful talk. And I'm pretty much sympathetic to this idea of understanding modernity along the lines of, let's say, a severely damaged sense of belonging and this idea of spelling out this damage as a loss of territory. My question concerns, let's say, not the spatial, but the temporal dimension of this kind of dispossession or loss of sense of belonging, because one might think that within this Western, if I may, ontology or cosmology, this idea of the telos has a temporal dimension. So it's a linear thinking. Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to simplify overtly, but I do think that in this idea of nature as bearing wisdom, there is an idea of another form of circular, I mean, that life has a circular form, so everything circles back, and therefore there is a different idea of understanding the relation of parts to the whole. And I would just love to hear a bit, maybe also from with your musicologist background, how this kind of thinking differently in terms of a different timely experience could help us with understanding, nature as an agent that is not exploitive, but kind of reproducing the conditions of being and not appropriating this. And I think this has a temporal dimension, and I would really love to further elaborate it.
It's interesting because maybe this idea that nature is a kind of circular time is a very strange notion of nature, and that exists just in philosophy until now. No? It means just this idea of nature as a kind of machine. No? That machine that's absolutely determined in a certain way. No? And of course, we have history that has a other type of open type of time. No? That's a closed time or type of time and an open type of time. And I'm very sensitive to all these philosophical essays to really rediscuss this distinction, insisting that there is a kind of natural history that is not just, as you said, not just the naturalization of history, but the historicization of nature too. Yeah? It means and this means this type of time doesn't exist in nature. There is not the time of nature. It's another thing. It's a social construction that we create in a certain moment of modernity to be sure that there is a kind of human exceptionalism between our time of humans and the other times of other types of living beings. But if we see what we know about, let's say, the natural time now and the development of forms in the natural forms in development, we will see something that we can find in determinacy, that we can find contingency, we can find fragmentation, what are normally attributes of the historical time. No? Maybe there is a very interesting task to us today to reframe this idea of what the relationship between time, nature, and history. No? Yeah.
So we have more 2 questions and 3 minutes. I will propose to join the 2 last questions, and then we pass to Vladimir, answer what he can.
Thank you so much. I'm coming back again to the question of the otherness and the relatedness. So I really like how you described the society as a society of metabolism, and I think I got why you said that we can't stick to the idea of recognition that comes from Hegel, because you said this is limited to the recognition of another consciousness, or maybe we can, in the Hegelian sense, recognize into institutions as well, but we are somehow recognized ourselves from the institutions. And then you said, I think this was your answer to one of those questions, that we need to develop another dimension of recognition. And I was wondering, if we relate ourselves to the other, namely the non-living, like things and so on, is it still a way that we have to account for in the concept of recognition, or would it be, because it seems that recognition somehow has internal the idea of that I'm recognized, but is the idea that if we describe the way I can recognize non-living things, what I'm doing in recognizing them, I get a different way of recognizing myself or the other living things or the other human beings and so on? Or is it more that we could describe it as well as just like knowing, relating, something different than recognition? Or is it, I stop with that.
No, it's
Thank
the
you.
question. No.
Second question, where is it? Where is the second?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. I have a question about psychoanalysis. It didn't come up explicitly, but it seemed to be in the background, and it was mentioned that you work on this as well. So especially in the moment where you were talking about the kind of anxiety of being determined by something other than oneself, I think even the term unconscious came up in this constellation. So I wanted to ask if you think that psychoanalysis is a useful or could offer us an alternative way to think about autonomy, especially when we consider certain Freudian formulations that might be problematic, such as where he speaks about how wo es war, soll ich werden, or where the id, or where it was, I should be, whether this kind of reasserts an identity of the subject that you would want to get rid of, or also other terms such as Besetzung, cathexis, which has the explicitly sort of military territorial connotation. So whether psychoanalysis is a useful paradigm to think of an alternative to autonomy, or whether that itself has to be subjected to a similar kind of deconstruction.
Okay, well, thank you for the 2 questions. I understand that you have just small times for answers. I just say for the second, yes, I think that psychoanalysis can help us a lot. And I think even the example that you gave, wo es war, soll ich werden, we can understand this in many, many distinct ways. There is this ego psychology way that say, well, where is the id, then the ego should be there. Or we can understand in a very distinct way, for example, like Lacanian one that I think is much more interesting, saying that there is something that is always in passing, and we knew how to relate ourselves to something that was in passing. And by the way, psychoanalysis is not a clinic on autonomy. It's a clinic that abandoned the notion of autonomy, but what doesn't mean that is a totally notion of determined action. And your question, I think that maybe I can give an image about what I'm thinking about these other levels of recognition. There is a passage in Odysseus when Odysseus came back to home 10 years after all the mess that they have done. And then he was as a beggar. And the first being that recognized Odysseus is not his wife or children, is the dog. And this is a very interesting point, because I always ask it, what would happen if even the dog didn't recognize him? No, because this would be really the most terrible thing that could happen. Because, and then, no, I can just finish with this. You know how Freud died? Freud said to his doctor, look, okay, you put me some medicines, and when I said stop, stop. And that is, he decided to stop when he has a dog, yeah? And he loved the dog. And once the dog was not able to be with him because of the smell of the gorge here. Yeah? And then he said, no, it's finished. Yeah? It means, but that is an interesting point. What happened, what means for us to be recognized by an animal? Yeah? How this can be another type of recognition, a very interesting point. Yeah? Okay, thank you.